December 5, 1941, 40 kilometers west of Moscow. The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. Oberleutnant Franz Hartmann pressed his frozen hands against the turret of his Panzer III, watching his breath crystallize instantly in the pre-dawn darkness. The engine refused to start. Around him, across the frozen landscape dotted with birch forests, dozens of other German tanks sat silent and immobile. Their oil congealed into black sludge. Their crews huddled inside, trying desperately to light fires beneath the engine blocks. Hartmann heard something then that made his blood run colder than the air around him. A low, mechanical rumble rolling across the snow from the east, growing louder. Russian tanks. Moving. Franz Hartmann had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, a young officer filled with the certainty that Germany's military machine was unstoppable. He had rolled through Poland in weeks, watched France collapse in 40 days, seen the seemingly invincible power of the Blitzkrieg shatter every army that stood before it. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, Hartmann believed what every German soldier believed, that the Soviet Union would fall before autumn came. The propaganda had told them the Slavs were subhuman, that their equipment was primitive, that their leadership was incompetent. The initial weeks of the invasion seemed to confirm everything. Soviet forces were encircled by the hundreds of thousands. Entire armies ceased to exist. The roads east were clogged with captured prisoners stretching to the horizon. But now, as winter descended with a ferocity unknown in Western Europe, as supplies failed to arrive and reinforcements never came, as the Russian counteroffensive began to materialize out of the frozen darkness, Hartmann understood that something fundamental had gone catastrophically wrong. His hands shook, and not just from the cold. This was fear, real fear, the kind that comes when certainty collapses, and you realize the machine you trusted absolutely has broken down with you, still inside it. The Battle of Moscow represented the first major German defeat of World War II, but more significantly, it marked the moment when Adolf Hitler's strategic vision collided with reality and shattered. For 6 months, the German military had executed the largest invasion in human history, advancing across a 1,000-mile front with 3 million men, 3,000 aircraft, and over 3,000 tanks. The objective was not merely to defeat the Soviet Union militarily, but to destroy it completely, to annihilate its armies, capture its resources, and reshape Eastern Europe according to Nazi racial ideology. Hitler had planned for a short campaign, 6 to 8 weeks at most, believing that the Soviet state would collapse like a rotten door once kicked in. The strategy was based on several assumptions: that Soviet military leadership was incompetent following Stalin's purges, that Soviet industry was primitive and incapable of replacing losses, that the Soviet people would welcome German forces as liberators from communism, and that the campaign would conclude before winter. Every single assumption proved catastrophically incorrect. The German advance into the Soviet Union initially appeared to validate Hitler's confidence. Army Group North pushed toward Leningrad. Army Group South drove into Ukraine. Army Group Center, the most powerful force, aimed directly at Moscow. Using classic Blitzkrieg tactics, rapid armored thrusts supported by tactical air power, designed to encircle and destroy enemy formations before they could organize defense, German forces achieved stunning victories. At the Battle of Białystok-Minsk in late June, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. At Smolensk in July, another 300,000. At Kiev in September, the largest encirclement in military history netted over 600,000 prisoners. These were victories of unprecedented scale. The Soviet Union appeared to be bleeding to death, losing entire armies faster than any nation could sustain. Yet the advance was slowing. German commanders began reporting something unexpected. Despite catastrophic losses, Soviet resistance was not collapsing but intensifying. Fresh divisions appeared where none should exist. Soviet soldiers fought with a fanaticism that defied rational military calculation, holding positions until annihilated rather than retreating. The German supply lines, stretching across vast distances over primitive roads that turned to impassable mud in autumn rains, began to break down. Ammunition ran short, fuel ran short, replacement parts for vehicles became scarce. Winter uniforms, which Hitler had specifically ordered not to be distributed because he insisted the campaign would be over by October, never arrived at the front. The operational and logistical challenges Germany faced in the Soviet Union represented problems of scale and environment for which the Wehrmacht was fundamentally unprepared. German tanks and vehicles were designed for the roads and conditions of Western Europe: paved highways, moderate climate, short distances between supply depots and fighting fronts. In the Soviet Union, paved roads essentially did not exist outside major cities. The German advance moved across dirt tracks that became bottomless mud during the Rasputitsa, the seasonal period of thaw and rain that turned the landscape into a quagmire. Vehicles broke down constantly. Tanks designed for 500 kilometers between major overhauls were running thousands of kilometers without proper maintenance, because repair facilities and spare parts could not reach them. The railway system, which Germany depended on for moving supplies forward, operated on a different gauge than European railways, requiring either conversion of track or transfer of cargo at the border, both impossibly time-consuming given the distances involved. By November 1941, when Army Group Center launched its final attempt to capture Moscow, German combat effectiveness had degraded catastrophically. Infantry divisions that had started the campaign at full strength of 17,000 men were down to fewer than 5,000. Panzer divisions that began with over 200 tanks had fewer than 50 operational. Soldiers were exhausted, having fought continuously for 5 months without adequate rest. Supply shortages meant reduced rations. The first winter clothing began arriving at the front in late November, but in quantities sufficient for perhaps 1/5 of the forces. Men fought in summer uniforms in -30-degree weather, wrapping themselves in newspaper and rags stolen from Russian civilians. The technology that had made Blitzkrieg so devastatingly effective in Poland and France proved remarkably fragile in Soviet conditions. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that formed the backbone of German armored forces were mechanically sophisticated machines, but that sophistication became a fatal weakness in extreme cold. Engines required specific grades of oil that became viscous and immobile below -20 degrees. Batteries lost charge overnight. Rubber components cracked and failed. Starting a tank in winter required hours of preparation, lighting fires beneath the engine, warming oil in buckets over flames, manually cranking components. Even when operational, German tanks struggled in snow and mud. Their relatively narrow tracks distributed weight poorly, causing them to sink and bog down. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34, were designed differently. The T-34 used a diesel engine rather than gasoline, which was less prone to freezing. Its wide tracks distributed weight better over snow. Its armor was sloped, making it more resistant to anti-tank shells than German tanks with vertical armor. Its 76mm gun could penetrate German armor at ranges where German guns could not penetrate Soviet armor. German tankers discovered, to their shock, that the supposedly primitive Russian equipment was in many ways superior to their own. A German tank commander named Otto Carius later wrote that encountering the T-34 was one of the most demoralizing experiences of the war. We could hit them again and again, and the shells would simply bounce off the sloped armor. Meanwhile, one hit from them would completely destroy our tanks. The winter itself became a weapon more devastating than any the Soviets possessed. Temperatures in December 1941 dropped to levels unrecorded in Western Europe, routinely reaching -30 to -40 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, human survival became a moment-by-moment struggle. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat. Men urinating froze before they could finish. Spit froze before hitting the ground. Weapons stopped functioning. The oil in machine guns congealed. Bolts refused to move. Firing pins shattered in the cold. German soldiers had no winter uniforms, no cold weather boots, no insulated gloves. They wrapped their feet in straw and newspaper. They wore multiple layers of whatever they could scavenge. They burned furniture and books to stay warm. Field hospitals overflowed with frostbite cases. Men with blackened hands and feet that would require amputation. The suffering was medieval in its intensity. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers, equipped for winter warfare with quilted clothing, felt boots, and fur hats, moved and fought effectively in conditions that rendered German forces nearly immobile. This was not merely a tactical advantage. It represented a fundamental asymmetry in operational capability. The German army, technologically advanced and tactically superior in conventional warfare, found itself defeated by an enemy that understood and exploited its own environment. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941, with a scale and ferocity that stunned German commanders. Fresh divisions, brought from Siberia and the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, struck along the entire front around Moscow. These were not the depleted, disorganized units Germans had been fighting for months. but full-strength formations equipped for winter warfare, with rested troops and functioning equipment. The attack hit Army Group Center at its most vulnerable moment, overstretched, undersupplied, exhausted, and frozen in place. German units that had advanced to within sight of Moscow's suburbs found themselves suddenly retreating in chaos. The retreat was not orderly or planned. It was panic. For the first time in the war, German soldiers ran. They abandoned equipment they could not start or move. They left behind wounded who could not walk. Villages that had been captured weeks earlier were retaken by Soviet forces. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. They had believed in their own invincibility, in the superiority of their doctrine and equipment, in the inevitable triumph of their cause. Now that belief was shattering in the frozen darkness as Russian tanks pursued them westward and Russian infantry appeared like ghosts out of snowstorms. Franz Hartmann survived the retreat from Moscow, though many of his comrades did not. His battalion abandoned over half its tanks, not destroyed by enemy action, but simply immobilized by cold and mechanical failure. The men marched westward through snow that reached their waists, carrying wounded on improvised sleds, burning villages to stay warm at night. Hartmann later wrote in a letter that reached his family months later, "We have seen things that should not be possible. Men freezing to death standing upright, too cold to fall. Russian children walking barefoot in snow that cripples us through our boots. We were told this would be easy. We were told we were superior. Now I know we were told lies, and those lies have killed better men than I will ever be. If we survive this, we will never be the same. The cold has gotten inside us, and it will never leave." This was not the writing of a Nazi ideologue or a fervent believer in Hitler's vision. This was the writing of a man whose certainty had been destroyed by reality. The Battle of Moscow was not the largest battle of World War II, nor was it the bloodiest. Stalingrad and Kursk would both exceed it in scale and casualties, but Moscow was the first time the Wehrmacht had been stopped, pushed back, and defeated. The implications were profound and immediate. Hitler's strategy for the entire war had been based on the assumption of rapid, decisive victories that would present Germany's enemies with fait accompli before they could mobilize their superior resources. This strategy had worked in Poland, in Norway, in France, in the Balkans. It failed in the Soviet Union. The failure at Moscow meant the war in the East would continue, that Soviet industry would have time to fully mobilize, that the Wehrmacht would have to fight a prolonged campaign for which it was neither equipped nor supplied. The strategic consequences rippled outward. Germany now faced a two-front war, the Soviets in the East and the British in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Resources had to be divided. Industrial production, already stretched, had to support multiple theatres simultaneously. The Luftwaffe, which had been concentrated in the East for Barbarossa, had to redeploy aircraft westward to defend against British bombing. The myth of German invincibility, which had been a powerful psychological weapon in itself, was broken. Hitler's reaction to the defeat at Moscow revealed both his strategic rigidity and his psychological fragility. He dismissed multiple senior commanders, including Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, and took personal command of military operations himself. He issued orders forbidding retreat under any circumstances, demanding that troops hold their positions regardless of tactical situation. This stand-fast order did prevent the retreat from becoming a complete rout, but it also ensured that German forces suffered far higher casualties than necessary, as units were surrounded and destroyed rather than withdrawing to defensible positions. Hitler interpreted the failure not as a flaw in his strategy, but as a failure of will by his commanders and troops. He believed that fanaticism and determination could overcome material realities. This belief would shape German military operations for the remainder of the war, leading to catastrophic decisions at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in the defense of Europe against the Allied invasions. The man who had achieved power, partly through his reputation as a strategic genius, revealed himself to be a gambler, who, when his gamble failed, doubled down rather than reconsidering his approach. The German army that retreated from Moscow in December 1941 and January 1942 was fundamentally different from the army that had invaded the Soviet Union 6 months earlier. It had lost approximately 830,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, over 1/4 of the invasion force. It had lost thousands of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles, many of which could not be replaced because German industry was not geared for prolonged war. But more significantly, it had lost its confidence and its tactical certainty. German soldiers had entered the Soviet Union believing they were racially and technologically superior to their enemies. They retreated having learned that Soviet soldiers fought with incredible determination, that Soviet equipment was often better than their own, and that Soviet commanders, despite their losses, were learning and adapting faster than German intelligence had predicted. The German military maintained its tactical excellence. Its training, leadership, and unit cohesion remained superior in most engagements. But tactical excellence alone could not overcome strategic overreach, logistical failure, and the sheer scale of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union paid an almost unimaginable price to achieve the victory at Moscow. Soviet casualties in 1941 exceeded 3 million soldiers killed or captured, along with hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. Entire regions were devastated. The Soviet economy had to be relocated. Thousands of factories were disassembled and moved east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach, then reassembled to continue production. The suffering of Soviet citizens and soldiers during this period defies comprehension. Yet the Soviet state survived. Stalin's regime, brutal and totalitarian as it was, maintained control and mobilized resources on a scale no other nation could match. Soviet industry began producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that would eventually overwhelm German forces through sheer numerical superiority. The Soviet military learned from its catastrophic early defeats, promoting competent commanders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky, adapting tactics, and developing operational art that would eventually prove superior to German doctrine in the specific conditions of the Eastern Front. The winter of 1941-1942 also marked the point at which the war's outcome became, if not inevitable, at least foreseeable to those willing to see clearly. Germany now faced not just the Soviet Union but, after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States as well. The combined industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States was many times greater than Germany's. Time was now Germany's enemy. Every month the war continued, the Allies grew stronger, while Germany's resources depleted. Hitler understood this at some level, which explains his increasingly desperate attempts to achieve decisive victories before Allied superiority became overwhelming. But he never adjusted his fundamental strategic approach. He continued to seek knockout blows, at Stalingrad in 1942, at Kursk in 1943, rather than adopting a defensive strategy that might have prolonged the war or achieved a negotiated settlement. His ideology prevented him from considering such options. Nazi doctrine was based on conquest and domination, on the belief in German racial superiority and the destiny of the Third Reich to rule Europe. Compromise or defensive thinking was, within this worldview, impossible. The technological and industrial dimensions of the Eastern Front evolved rapidly after 1941. The Soviets introduced new equipment that was specifically designed for their conditions and operational doctrine. The T-34 tank, already superior to early German tanks, was produced in massive quantities, over 84,000 during the war. Soviet artillery, always numerous, became more mobile and better coordinated. The Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, heavily armored and designed specifically for close air support, was produced in greater numbers than any other military aircraft in history. Soviet logistics, while never efficient by Western standards, proved adequate for their needs because they operated on shorter supply lines within their own territory. Germany, meanwhile, introduced new equipment like the Tiger and Panther tanks, which were technologically superior to anything the Soviets fielded, but could not be produced in sufficient quantities to matter strategically. A Tiger tank might destroy 10 T-34s, but the Soviets could replace those 10 tanks while Germany could not replace the Tiger. This arithmetic of attrition defined the war in the East after Moscow. German forces won most tactical engagements, but lost the strategic war because they could not sustain their losses, while the Soviets, despite horrific casualties, could. The human dimension of the Eastern Front remained uniquely brutal throughout the war. This was not merely a military conflict but an ideological war of annihilation. Nazi racial ideology defined Slavs as subhuman and communism as an existential threat that had to be eradicated. This ideology translated into policies of deliberate starvation, mass execution of prisoners, and wholesale destruction of civilian populations. The Wehrmacht was not merely complicit in these atrocities, but actively participated in them. German soldiers burned villages, executed partisans and suspected partisans, and stood by while SS units murdered Jews and political commissars. Soviet forces, fighting for survival against an enemy that sought their complete destruction, responded with equal brutality. German prisoners were routinely executed. Captured German soldiers faced years in Soviet labor camps, where mortality rates were horrific. Civilians in areas retaken from German occupation faced accusations of collaboration, often ending in execution or deportation. The Eastern Front became a descent into barbarism that exceeded anything seen in Western Europe during the war. The specific tactical dynamics of the Moscow counteroffensive revealed how profoundly the Soviet military had evolved even in the catastrophic opening months of the war. General Zhukov, commanding the defense of Moscow, had learned critical lessons from the encirclement battles of summer and autumn 1941. He understood that German operational doctrine depended on mobility and concentration of force, identifying weak points in enemy lines, breaking through with armored spearheads, then encircling and destroying isolated formations. Zhukov's defensive strategy aimed to deny the Germans these opportunities. Soviet forces established defense in depth, with multiple fortified lines that could absorb German attacks without collapsing. Anti-tank guns and obstacles were positioned to channel German armor into killing zones. Reserve formations were held back, hidden from German reconnaissance, ready to counterattack once German forces were committed and extended. This was sophisticated operational thinking, a far cry from the disorganized chaos of the initial German invasion. When the counteroffensive began, Soviet forces did not simply push forward uniformly, but targeted specific German salients, seeking to encircle and destroy isolated units using the same tactics Germans had employed so effectively earlier. The counteroffensive was not without its failures. Soviet forces lacked the logistical support and coordination to achieve the kind of comprehensive encirclement that German forces had managed at Kiev or Bryansk. But the intent was clear, and the execution, while imperfect, was sufficient to drive German forces back and inflict significant casualties. The experience of individual soldiers during the Moscow battle and subsequent retreat illuminates the human reality beneath. Strategic narratives. German infantry private Hans Roth kept a diary throughout the Eastern Front campaign until his death in 1943. His entries from December 1941 describe a descent into hell. On December 8th, he wrote about watching a comrade named Wilhelm freeze to death during a night march. Wilhelm simply sat down in the snow and said he needed to rest. We tried to make him stand, to keep moving, but he pushed us away. 10 minutes later, when we came back for him, he was dead, sitting upright with his eyes open, frozen solid. We could not even close his eyes. They were ice. On December 12th, we found a village and fought the Russians for it. Not for strategic reasons, for the houses, for walls and roofs, for fireplaces. We would have killed our own comrades for a warm room. This is what we have become. On December 19th, I saw a man eat snow until he died. The medic said it was hypothermia, that eating snow lowers your body temperature. But we are all so thirsty. The water in our canteens is frozen. What else can we do? These entries, written in cramped handwriting in a leather-bound journal recovered after Roth's death, capture the immediate physical and psychological degradation of the German army in ways that operational histories cannot. Soviet soldiers experienced different but equally intense suffering. Junior Lieutenant Vasily Grossman, who served as a war correspondent throughout the conflict, wrote extensively about the Moscow counteroffensive. He described Soviet infantry advancing through snowstorms, navigating by compass when visibility dropped to a few meters, stumbling upon German positions suddenly, and fighting in close quarters with grenades and bayonets. He wrote about a young soldier named Nikolai, who had joined the army after his entire family was killed in the German advance. Nikolai fought with what Grossman described as not courage, but fury, a desperate, consuming need to hurt those who had hurt him. Nikolai survived the advance, but was killed in January during a German counterattack. Grossman wrote, "He died as he had fought, angry and afraid and determined, which is to say, he died like most soldiers die, without glory or meaning, simply stopped from existing by metal and physics." This unsentimental view of combat, stripped of propaganda and heroic narrative, runs throughout Grossman's war writing. He saw the Eastern Front clearly, the waste, the suffering, the randomness of death, and recorded it with a journalist's precision and a novelist's empathy. The command-level decisions during the Battle of Moscow revealed the contrasting strategic cultures of German and Soviet militaries. German commanders, trained in the tradition of Auftragstactic, mission-type orders that gave subordinate commanders considerable freedom to accomplish objectives using their own judgment, found themselves increasingly constrained by Hitler's personal involvement. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw to defensible winter positions. Hitler refused. General Heinz Guderian, commander of 2nd Panzer Army, personally flew to Hitler's headquarters to argue for retreat. Hitler dismissed him from command. The pattern repeated across the front. Professional military officers recognizing tactical and operational realities, requesting freedom to respond appropriately, and being overruled by Hitler's ideologically driven insistence on holding every meter of ground. This created a command crisis that went beyond the immediate battle. German officers began to understand that their professional judgment was subordinate to political considerations, that military logic could be overridden by Hitler's will, and that the Wehrmacht was no longer a professional military organization making decisions based on operational necessities but an instrument of Nazi ideology that would be sacrificed. To preserve Hitler's prestige, Soviet command dynamics were different but equally complex. Stalin had personally interfered disastrously in military operations during the opening months of Barbarossa, refusing to allow retreats, dismissing intelligence warnings, and promoting incompetent but politically loyal commanders. The catastrophic encirclements of summer 1941 were partly attributable to Stalin's interference. By the time of the Moscow battle, Stalin had begun to listen more carefully to professional military advice, particularly from Zhukov, who had proven himself during the defense of Leningrad. Zhukov operated with considerable authority during the Moscow counteroffensive, making operational decisions without constant political interference. But the Soviet system remained brutally unforgiving of failure. Commanders who lost battles faced not just dismissal but arrest and execution. This created a culture of extreme risk aversion in some commanders and reckless aggression in others, as officers calculated whether cautious failure or bold failure would be treated more leniently. The Soviet military, like the Soviet state, operated on terror as much as competence, and this terror shaped decision-making at every level. The aftermath of the Moscow battle extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains and losses. The psychological impact on both militaries was profound and lasting. German soldiers who survived the winter of 1941 to 1942 were permanently changed by the experience. Letters and diaries from later in the war repeatedly reference Moscow and that first winter as the moment when they lost faith in their leaders, in their equipment, in their own survival, in the justness of their cause. This erosion of morale was gradual but cumulative. German formations in 1942 and 1943 still fought effectively, but the certainty and aggression that had characterized the early war years was gone. Soldiers fought, not because they believed in victory, but because they had no alternative. Because discipline and unit cohesion compelled them. Because surrender to Soviet forces was often tantamount to death. The Wehrmacht remained a formidable military force throughout the war, but it was a force fighting from increasing desperation rather than confidence. Soviet forces gained confidence from the Moscow victory, but that confidence was tempered by the enormous casualties they had suffered. The Red Army that stopped the Germans at Moscow was different from the army that had been shattered in the opening months of Barbarossa, but it was not yet the army that would ultimately crush German forces in 1944 and 1945. The Soviet military, in winter 1941 to 1942, was still learning, still suffering from poor coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, still plagued by supply problems and communication failures. Soviet commanders attempted to expand the counteroffensive beyond Moscow, trying to encircle and destroy Army Group Center completely. These operations largely failed. German forces, despite their weakened state, defended skillfully and avoided encirclement. Soviet casualties during the winter offensive were extremely high, often exceeding German casualties in many operations. The Red Army won the Battle of Moscow not through superior skill, but through superior numbers, better preparation for winter warfare, and the strategic advantage of defending interior lines while the Germans were overextended. It would take another year of brutal fighting before Soviet operational art matured to the point where it could consistently defeat German forces through maneuver and tactics. Rather than simply attrition, the international implications of the Moscow battle reverberated across the global conflict. When the German advance on Moscow began in October 1941, many observers worldwide believed Soviet defeat was imminent. The American and British governments were preparing contingency plans for a world in which Germany controlled the entire European continent and Soviet resources. Japan, allied with Germany through the Tripartite Pact, was debating whether to attack the Soviet Union from the east, potentially crushing it between two fronts. The Soviet victory at Moscow changed these calculations fundamentally. Japan decided against attacking the Soviet Union, choosing instead to expand southward into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, a decision that led directly to Pearl Harbor and American entry into the war. Britain, which had been fighting alone against Germany since France's fall, suddenly had a powerful ally whose survival seemed assured. American military aid to the Soviet Union, authorized under Lend-Lease but proceeding slowly due to doubts about Soviet viability, increased significantly after Moscow. The battle transformed the Soviet Union from a likely victim into a crucial member of the anti-German coalition, and this transformation shaped Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The propaganda dimensions of the Moscow battle were exploited intensively by all sides. Soviet propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of communist superiority and Stalin's genius. The narrative emphasized the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the wisdom of Soviet leadership, while minimizing the horrific casualties and near-catastrophic initial defeats. Stalin positioned himself as the architect of victory, despite his interference having contributed significantly to early disasters. Soviet citizens, desperate for good news after months of catastrophic losses, embraced this narrative. Moscow's survival became a symbol of national resistance and the beginning of eventual triumph. German propaganda faced a more difficult task. The defeat could not be hidden. Too many soldiers were writing letters home describing the retreat and the suffering. Nazi propagandists blamed the weather, claiming that the unusually early and harsh winter had temporarily halted operations, but that victory would be achieved in the spring. They emphasized Soviet casualties, which were indeed higher than German losses, and portrayed the retreat as a strategic repositioning rather than a defeat. This propaganda was increasingly ineffective. German civilians could read between the lines of official communiques and soldiers' letters. The myth of invincibility was broken, and no amount of propaganda could restore it. Franz Hartmann did not survive the war. Records show he was killed in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk, Germany's last major offensive operation in the east. His letters home, preserved by his family, trace a psychological trajectory that was common among German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Early letters from 1941 are confident, even triumphant, describing easy victories and the weakness of Soviet forces. Letters from late 1941 and 1942 become darker, describing cold, casualties, and growing doubt. Final letters from 1943 are fatalistic, written by a man who knows he will not survive, but continues fighting because there is nothing else to do. In one of his last letters, he wrote, "I no longer remember what we are fighting for. We are told it is for Germany, for civilization, for the future. But here there is only snow and death and the certainty that tomorrow will be worse than today. If there is justice in the world, we will lose this war. We must lose it. What we have done here cannot be forgiven. And I cannot forgive myself for being part of it." This is the voice of a man whose entire worldview has collapsed, who has seen through the propaganda and ideology to the reality beneath, and who has found that reality unbearable. The question of how the Battle of Moscow changed Hitler's strategy is complex because Hitler himself never fully acknowledged the defeat's implications. In public statements and private discussions with his inner circle, he attributed the failure to temporary factors: the unusually harsh winter, the incompetence of specific commanders, insufficient will among the troops. He never accepted that his fundamental strategic vision was flawed, or that victory over the Soviet Union might be impossible. Yet his actions revealed a shift. After Moscow, German strategy in the East became more cautious and opportunistic. The 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, aimed not at Moscow, but at the southern Soviet Union, the oil fields of the Caucasus and the transportation hub of Stalingrad. This was a shift from trying to decapitate the Soviet state by capturing its capital to trying to cripple its economy by seizing resources. The offensive initially succeeded, advancing hundreds of kilometers, but ultimately failed catastrophically at Stalingrad, where an entire German army of over 200,000 men was encircled and destroyed. The pattern established at Moscow repeated at Stalingrad. Initial success, overextension, Soviet counteroffensive, German defeat. Hitler's inability to learn from failure ensured that the pattern would repeat again at Kursk in 1943, and in countless smaller operations. The broader strategic implications of Moscow extended beyond the Eastern Front. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union quickly meant that Germany had to maintain massive military forces in the East indefinitely, which made defending against Allied operations in other theatres increasingly difficult. When the Allies invaded North Africa in late 1942, Germany could spare limited forces to defend there because the Eastern Front consumed most of its army. When the Allies invaded Italy in 1943, the same constraint applied. When the Allies invaded France in June 1944, Germany faced a three-front war, East, West, and South, that was simply unsustainable. The German army in 1944 was larger and better equipped than in 1941, but it was spread thin across thousands of kilometers, defending everywhere and therefore strong nowhere. The mobility and concentration of force that had made Blitzkrieg effective were impossible when every front demanded reinforcements simultaneously. This dispersal of German military power was the direct consequence of failing to defeat the Soviet Union quickly, and that failure began at Moscow. The Soviet victory at Moscow also had profound effects on Allied strategy and the broader coalition against Germany. Stalin had pleaded with Britain to open a second front in Western Europe in 1941 to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. The British, still recovering from defeats in France and the Battle of Britain, were unable and unwilling to invade continental Europe so quickly. The Soviet ability to stop the German advance at Moscow demonstrated that the Soviet Union would survive, which meant the Allies had time to build up forces for eventual invasion. It also meant that the Soviet Union would play the decisive role in defeating Germany, which had post-war implications for the political shape of Europe. Churchill and Roosevelt understood that whoever occupied German territory at war's end would control post-war Europe. The Soviet advance from Moscow to Berlin would determine the boundaries of Soviet influence, creating the Iron Curtain that would divide Europe for 45 years. In this sense, the Battle of Moscow was not just a military turning point, but a political one, setting in motion the dynamics that would define the second half of the 20th century. The technological lessons of the Eastern Front influenced military doctrine worldwide in the post-war era. The Soviet experience demonstrated that mass production of adequate equipment was more effective than small numbers of sophisticated equipment. The T-34, mechanically simple and easy to manufacture, could be produced quickly and repaired in the field, making it a more effective weapon system than technically superior but complex German tanks. This lesson influenced post-war Soviet military doctrine and was studied carefully by Western militaries. The Eastern Front also demonstrated the importance of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Germany's tactical and operational excellence meant nothing when their logistics collapsed and their industry could not replace losses. The United States, which entered the war with a relatively small military but enormous industrial capacity, understood this clearly and structured its military around the principle of overwhelming material superiority. The American way of war in the second half of the 20th century, in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars, emphasized firepower, technological advantage, and logistical depth rather than tactical elegance. The environmental factors that proved so decisive at Moscow became a consistent theme throughout the Eastern Front campaign. German forces never adequately adapted to Soviet weather conditions. Each winter brought renewed suffering as supply systems failed to provide adequate winter equipment. German vehicles continued to break down in cold weather. German soldiers continued to suffer frostbite casualties at horrific rates. The Soviets, by contrast, operated effectively in conditions that would have paralyzed Western armies. This represented a fundamental advantage that went beyond military skill or technological sophistication. The Soviet Union was fighting on its own territory, in its own climate, with soldiers who understood instinctively how to survive and function in conditions that German soldiers found incomprehensible. This home field advantage amplified Soviet numerical and industrial superiority, making German victory progressively less likely as the war continued. The human cost of the Eastern Front remains difficult to comprehend. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during World War II, including both military personnel and civilians. To put this in perspective, that is more than the entire population of many countries. Germany lost approximately 5 million military personnel, the majority on the Eastern Front. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of refugees fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance. Millions more were killed in deliberate genocidal actions by both sides. The psychological trauma of the Eastern Front shaped Soviet and Russian national identity for generations. The memory of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, became central to Soviet propaganda and continues to be central to Russian national mythology today. The suffering was real, the threat was existential, and the victory came at a price that is almost impossible for those who did not experience it to understand. The Battle of Moscow was the beginning of that victory and the beginning of that suffering. The winter battlefield, 40 kilometers west of Moscow, where Oberleutnant Franz Hartmann heard Soviet tanks approaching in the pre-dawn darkness of December 5, 1941, looks different today. The fields where German tanks stood frozen and immobile are now farmland. The birch forests remain silent and beautiful, with no indication of the violence that occurred there. There are memorials maintained by the Russian government marking the defense of Moscow. Veterans, increasingly few as the years pass, gather there on Victory Day to remember comrades who did not survive. The physical landscape has healed, as physical landscapes do. The human landscape has not. The memory of that winter, of the suffering and the dying and the desperate struggle for survival, remains vivid for those who experienced it and has been passed down through families and national narratives to those who did not. The individual experiences of soldiers during the Moscow campaign reveal patterns that transcended national boundaries. Fear, exhaustion, hunger, cold. These were universal experiences that bound German and Soviet soldiers together in ways that propaganda and ideology could not separate. A German medic named Klaus Huber wrote in his diary about treating a severely wounded Soviet prisoner in late December 1941. The man was dying from abdominal wounds, had no chance of survival, and both he and Huber knew it. Huber spoke no Russian, and the Soviet soldier spoke no German, but they sat together in a ruined farmhouse while the man died. Huber wrote, "He showed me photographs of his children. 3 daughters, beautiful girls. He cried, I cried. I gave him morphine, more than I should have, enough to let him sleep and not wake. He held my hand and said something in Russian, over and over. I do not know what it meant, but I understood. We are all just men, far from home, dying for causes we no longer understand, if we ever did." This moment of shared humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter was rare but not unique. Throughout the war, individual soldiers on both sides experienced moments when the propaganda dissolved and they recognized their enemies as human beings trapped in the same hell. The transformation of the Eastern Front from a war of movement to a war of attrition accelerated after Moscow. German forces, unable to achieve the rapid knockout victories that Blitzkrieg doctrine required, increasingly found themselves fighting for small tactical gains at enormous cost. Soviet forces, learning from their defeats and drawing on seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower, traded casualties for time and space, wearing down German strength through continuous pressure. This attritional warfare resembled the Western Front of World War I more than the mobile warfare that had characterized 1939 to 1941. It was grinding, exhausting, and consumed men and material at rates that neither side could sustain indefinitely. The difference was that the Soviet Union, with its vast population and relocated industry, could sustain losses longer than Germany. The arithmetic was brutal but simple. Germany was running out of soldiers faster than the Soviet Union, and no amount of tactical skill could alter that fundamental reality. The winter of 1941-1942 established patterns that would define the remainder of the Eastern Front campaign. Each summer, German forces would launch offensives, using their superior tactical skills and remaining mobility to achieve initial victories. Each winter, Soviet forces would counterattack, using weather and numbers to push German forces back. The front line would shift back and forth across hundreds of kilometers, leaving devastation in its wake. Entire regions were depopulated. Agriculture collapsed. Transportation infrastructure was systematically destroyed by retreating forces on both sides. The occupied territories of the Western Soviet Union became a wasteland, a killing ground where military operations, partisan warfare, and genocidal policies created conditions of almost unimaginable suffering for the civilian population. The partisan warfare that intensified after the Moscow battle added another dimension of brutality to the conflict. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines attacked supply convoys, destroyed railways, assassinated German officials, and tied down significant German military resources. German anti-partisan operations were savage, involving collective punishment of civilians, destruction of entire villages, and mass executions. The partisan war blurred the distinction between combatants and civilians, creating a cycle of violence that escalated throughout the war. German soldiers, already brutalized by the conditions of the Eastern Front, committed atrocities against civilians on a massive scale, justified by Nazi racial ideology and the genuine threat that partisans posed to German rear areas. Soviet partisans, operating in conditions of extreme deprivation and motivated by hatred of the occupiers, responded with equal brutality. The partisan war was characterized by torture, mutilation, and the systematic targeting of civilians suspected of collaboration with the enemy. It was warfare stripped of any pretense of civilized conduct, a descent into barbarism that left permanent scars on the regions where it occurred. The evolution of German military thinking after Moscow revealed an institution in crisis. The Wehrmacht had entered the war as perhaps the most professionally competent military organization in the world, with doctrine refined through careful study of World War I, training that emphasized initiative and adaptability, and equipment that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The failures on the Eastern Front exposed limitations in this system. German doctrine was designed for short, decisive campaigns against Western-style militaries. It was not designed for prolonged warfare against an enemy that could absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. In an environment that negated many of Germany's technological advantages, across distances that strained logistics beyond breaking point, German commanders recognized these limitations and attempted to adapt. But adaptation was constrained by Hitler's increasingly direct control of military operations and by resource limitations that made fundamental changes in force structure impossible. The result was a military that became progressively less effective, even as individual units maintained high standards of training and cohesion. Soviet military evolution followed a different trajectory. The Red Army of 1941 was poorly led, badly equipped, and doctrinally confused. The purges of the late 1930s had decimated the officer corps, removing experienced commanders and replacing them with politically reliable but militarily incompetent men. Soviet doctrine emphasized offensive operations and deep battle concepts, but the disorganization and poor training of forces made implementing these concepts impossible. The defeats of 1941 forced a brutal winnowing process. Incompetent commanders were removed, often fatally. Officers who demonstrated competence were rapidly promoted regardless of political background. The Soviet military began to develop doctrine specifically suited to its strengths and weaknesses, accepting that Soviet soldiers were less skilled individually than German soldiers, but learning to leverage superior numbers through careful planning and overwhelming firepower. By 1943, the Red Army had evolved into a formidable military machine, still suffering higher casualties than German forces, but winning battles through operational sophistication and material superiority. The personal transformation of survivors on both sides created a generation marked permanently by the experience of the Eastern Front. German soldiers who survived and returned home after the war found that they could not speak about their experiences, the things they had seen and done, the conditions they had endured, the crimes they had witnessed or participated in. These were not things that could be discussed in the rebuilt, prosperous West Germany of the 1950s and 1960s. Many German veterans remained silent about their service for decades, until age and distance from the events finally allowed them to speak. Their testimony, given in old age, reveals men still haunted by memories of cold, hunger, fear, and death. They speak of comrades lost, of senseless suffering, of a war that should never have been fought. They rarely speak of ideology or grand strategy. The Eastern Front burned away abstractions, leaving only the immediate reality of survival and loss. Soviet veterans faced different but equally profound challenges. Soviet propaganda celebrated the victory over fascism and the heroism of Soviet soldiers, but it did not acknowledge the full extent of suffering or the mistakes that had led to catastrophic early defeats. Soviet veterans were expected to embody heroic narratives, not to speak about fear, doubt, or the chaos and brutality they had actually experienced. Many Soviet soldiers who survived German captivity were treated as traitors upon their return, suspected of collaboration simply because they had surrendered. Soviet veterans learned to tell official stories about their service, while keeping their true memories private. Only in the late Soviet period and after the collapse of the Soviet Union did space open for more honest recollection. The oral histories collected from Soviet veterans in recent decades reveal experiences that contradict official Soviet narratives. They speak of incompetent commanders, of pointless attacks that achieved nothing but casualties, of fear and confusion, of moments of humanity amid brutality. These testimonies, like those of German veterans, emphasize the human reality beneath the strategic and ideological narratives. The Battle of Moscow's place in historical memory differs significantly between Russia and the West. In Russia and the former Soviet Union, the battle is commemorated as one of the decisive moments of the Great Patriotic War, the first major victory that demonstrated the Soviet Union's ability to resist and ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. Victory Day celebrations in Moscow feature parades and ceremonies honoring the defenders of the city. The battle has been depicted in numerous Soviet and Russian films, books, and television programs, generally emphasizing heroism and sacrifice while downplaying the chaos and suffering. In the West, the Battle of Moscow receives less attention than Stalingrad or the Normandy invasion, partly because Western forces were not involved, and partly because the Eastern Front generally receives less coverage in English-language histories than the Western Front. This difference in historical memory reflects broader patterns in how World War II is remembered. In Russia as a national experience of suffering and triumph, in the West as a story of Allied cooperation and the defeat of fascism. The strategic lessons of Moscow remain relevant to contemporary military thinking. The battle demonstrated that technological and tactical superiority can be negated by environmental factors, logistical failure, and enemy adaptation. It showed that initial victories in a campaign do not guarantee ultimate success if the strategic foundations are unsound. It revealed the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities and will to resist based on ideological assumptions rather than rational analysis. Modern militaries study the Moscow campaign as an example of operational overreach, the extension of forces beyond the point where they can be adequately supplied and supported. The parallels to other military failures, from Napoleon's 1812 campaign in Russia to various American interventions, are obvious to military historians and strategists. The fundamental lessons are simple, but apparently difficult to internalize. Logistics matter more than tactics, environment matters more than doctrine, an enemy will to resist cannot be assumed or predicted based on one's own assumptions about their society or ideology. What the Battle of Moscow revealed, ultimately, was the limit of will and ideology when confronted with material reality. Hitler believed that determination and racial superiority could overcome any obstacle. He believed that the Soviet Union was weak and would collapse easily. He believed that winter could be ignored or endured through force of will. He was wrong on every count. The Soviet state, brutal and oppressive as it was, commanded the loyalty, or at least the obedience of its people in a way that sustained it through catastrophic defeats. Soviet industry, moved and reconstituted under conditions of desperate urgency, produced weapons in quantities that Germany could not match. Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homes and families against an enemy that sought their extermination, found reserves of determination that German soldiers, fighting for an abstract ideology in a foreign land, could not sustain. And winter, indifferent to propaganda and ideology, killed with perfect equality anyone inadequately prepared for it. The German army in December 1941 learned what Napoleon's army had learned in 1812, that Russia is not conquered easily, that its space and climate are weapons as powerful as any army, and that confidence alone is not sufficient when reality proves different than expected. The Battle of Moscow forced Hitler to rethink his strategy, though not in the way his generals hoped. They wanted him to recognize that the war in the East was unwinnable and to seek a negotiated settlement or at least adopt a defensive posture. He refused. Instead, he redoubled his commitment to ideological war, became more directly involved in military operations, and dismissed any commander who suggested caution or retreat. This rigidity would characterize German strategy for the remainder of the war, leading to increasingly desperate gambles and refusal to acknowledge reality until reality became undeniable. By the time Hitler finally acknowledged that Germany had lost the war, in the bunker beneath Berlin in April 1945, the nation he had led lay in ruins, its cities destroyed, its people starving, its armies shattered. The direct line from the frozen fields west of Moscow to the rubble of Berlin is clear. The decision to invade the Soviet Union, the failure to defeat it quickly, and the refusal to adapt strategy when that failure became obvious. These were the decisions that doomed Nazi Germany. For those who study military history, the Eastern Front offers lessons that remain relevant. The importance of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare. The danger of ideological certainty that prevents adaptation to changing circumstances. The limits of tactical excellence when strategic fundamentals are unsound. The catastrophic consequences when leaders ignore professional military advice in favor of political or ideological considerations. These lessons were not learned easily. They were learned through the suffering and death of millions, through cities reduced to rubble, through landscapes transformed into killing fields. The Eastern Front was not merely a military campaign, but a demonstration of what happens when modern industrial states commit themselves to total war guided by totalitarian ideologies. The suffering was not incidental to the conflict, but intrinsic to it. The inevitable consequence when nations fight not just for territory or resources, but for existential survival or ideological dominance. The frozen battlefield where Franz Hartmann heard Russian tanks approaching in December 1941 was the place where Hitler's vision of quick victory and German supremacy collided with reality and shattered. The sound of those tank engines rumbling across the snow represented something more than a tactical reversal or even a strategic defeat. It represented the end of certainty, the collapse of ideology into brutal fact, the moment when belief in inevitable triumph transformed into knowledge of possible extinction. Every soldier, in every frozen tank and foxhole along that front understood, in that moment, that they had been lied to. The war would not be short. The enemy was not weak. Winter would not be endured through determination alone. And they, who had believed themselves invincible, were about to discover what defeat felt like. The Battle of Moscow was where Hitler was forced to rethink his entire strategy, though he never admitted it and never adjusted it sufficiently. The consequences of that failure to rethink properly would unfold over the next 3.5 years across a continent in suffering measured in millions of lives. The eastern approach to Moscow, where Soviet and German armies collided in the winter of 1941, became the hinge on which the entire war turned. Everything before it was German advance and Allied retreat. Everything after it was German retreat and Allied advance, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum until the final collapse. The snow that fell on those frozen fields in December 1941 covered German soldiers who had marched east, certain of victory. When the snow melted in spring 1942, those who remained were already beginning the long, terrible retreat that would end in Berlin 3 years later. The battle that forced Hitler to rethink his strategy was the beginning of the end, though millions more would die before that end finally came. In the silence of those frozen fields west of Moscow, where birch trees sway in the wind and snow falls each winter as it always has, the ghosts of that December remain. They speak in the wind of certainty destroyed, of ideology collapsing under the weight of reality, of the terrible price paid when leaders gamble with millions of lives on assumptions that prove catastrophically wrong. The Battle of Moscow was not the largest or bloodiest battle of World War II, but it was perhaps the most consequential, the moment when the war's outcome shifted from uncertain to inevitable, when the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility shattered, and when Hitler's grand vision of conquest collided with the immovable reality of Soviet resistance and Russian winter. The tanks that rumbled through the snow that December morning were not just machines of war, but harbingers of a future that Hitler could not accept and could not prevent, a future where Germany would be defeated, where Nazism would be destroyed, and where the terrible gamble of Operation Barbarossa would be revealed as the greatest strategic miscalculation in military history. The gamble of Operation Barbarossa would be revealed as the greatest strategic miscalculation in military history.